I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question. In this half-hour podcast series from the Centre for Independent Studies, we explore questions and challenges to liberalism today. My guest today is Professor Steven Schwartz, a man whose original doctoral work was in psychology but has been a medical dean, and the only person I've ever heard of who's been a vice-chancellor of 3 universities, Brunel in the United Kingdom, Murdoch in Western Australia, and of course Macquarie University here in New South Wales, where I'm recording. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
One of the issues we're discovering in our podcast series is that even to know what liberalism is takes some thought. When you hear the word liberalism, what do you think it is?
When I hear the word liberalism, I think of the 3 main factors, at least for me. And those are limited government.
Equality,
that's number 1.
Under the law.
Equality
and
under the law.
Autonomy.
And personal autonomy. That liberalism is about individuals. It's not about social groups.
The flourishing of everybody in the society.
The flourishing of everybody in the society.
And you think this is the best system, or you're an advocate of this kind of liberalism?
Yes, I think I am an advocate of this kind of liberalism because if you boil it down to an everyday saying, what we're really talking about is an attitude of live and let live. And when you're a liberal, when you're a classical liberal, and remember there are different ways of using the term liberal, but when you're a classical liberal, you're really saying we want everyone to be able to live their lives according to their own needs and their own desires, provided that they don't interfere with other people living their lives in the same way. So there's a kind of non-aggression pact that's necessary for a liberal society to flourish. If you think about those as the main value of liberalism, then wouldn't everybody be in favor of giving everybody an opportunity to flourish?
If that's so, why isn't everybody in favour of liberalism? It's under threat today, is it not?
It is, but that gets back to the other issue that I just briefly mentioned, and then what do you mean by liberalism? Because to know what they're against, we have to kind of know what it is they're thinking about. And it's not always clear. So in the USA, when they use the word liberal, they mean anyone sort of left of center is liberal. Yeah. And that's a huge number of people with different views on different attitudes. When we use the word liberalism here, we tend to think of more European terms of the kind of social organization that developed in response to monarchies and so on in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, where those were disappearing and they were being replaced with social arrangements that valued individuals rather than unelected leaders. What sort of liberalism are you talking about that's being rejected? I know there's a whole series of books that have been coming out over the last year or two about the decline of liberalism, the defeat of liberalism, I think is one. And there are a whole number of them. But they're mainly talking about American style liberalism, which, as I said, is a very amorphous concept and seems to cover a lot of ground that we wouldn't think of here as having much to do with liberalism.
So you don't think liberalism, as you understand it, is under threat or challenged?
I think it's won the argument, frankly. I think where I see the threat coming from is what's often referred to as wide politics and narrow politics. Wide politics meaning the battle of ideas that goes on through centuries and goes on through different cultures, and the battle of ideas of what's good in the world and how should the world be organized and what should be rewarded and what shouldn't be. I actually think liberalism won that argument decades ago, and I sort of agree with Fukuyama. It happened and it won. But then there's narrow politics, and that's basically who gets elected and runs the country. And the connection that you'd hope to find between the battle of ideas and the arguments and then the outcomes for election, it doesn't seem to have happened. So liberalism may have actually won that battle of ideas, but it hasn't won the narrow politics. The Leviathan is still there, and the Leviathan is still growing.
That is the power of coercive. By Leviathan, the Hobbes term of Thomas Hobbes, correct. You mean the power of coercive government.
Exactly. It's actually growing, and we've just seen a big example of it over the last few years in COVID. Where many things happened in our country, in Australia, that you never would have thought would ever happen.
Let me push back then on this. Push back on this. Liberalism is live and let live, but surely there are situations where that is dangerous because of threats like pandemics, like inequality, like violence. That just simply trusting people to do their own thing and all shall be well is a naive view of the world. I'm proposing as a devil advocating.
I agree. Being a liberal and being in favour of individual autonomy doesn't mean there are no limits. I mean, so I still think there should be rules about how fast you speed on a highway. And being a liberal doesn't mean that you can drive the wrong way down the one-way street because you happen to feel like it or because it's closer. So I do think there are clearly restraints that we have to live by in order to have a functioning world. But it's a matter of the proportionality of those and what it is you're trying to achieve when you initiate those constraints on liberty, and whether when you have a situation where governments, as we saw in COVID, were creating new rules which didn't apply to some people but applied to others. So sporting heroes were allowed to come to Western Australia, but you weren't, or I wasn't, and I lived there.
But surely that's egregious failure of the policy being applied, but not attack on the policy itself.
But that's that's really what I'm trying to say. So there appears to be a disconnect between liberalism writ large, liberalism in the wide area of politics, and liberalism in the narrow area of politics, where we're talking about who gets elected and what it is they do once they get there. And we don't seem to have won that battle of ideas.
And I'm wondering whether there's something in liberalism, it's something incomplete about liberalism itself that makes it vulnerable to this creeping in. For example, you said the principle of do no harm. You're free to do what you want without harming others.
Well, without keeping them from doing what they want to do. Yes.
Now, the trouble is, I hear a lot of modern discourse using liberal language about harm. In fact, in many cases, harm's become the only public morality other than authenticity. If I say this, I'm going to harm that group. Harm's become a growing anxiety and source of limitation of liberty. I cannot say those words, what I think about some groups in society, because of harm.
Yes. That's right. And maybe harm is another word, like liberalism, which has got many different meanings to different people. So often that harm you're referring to is hurt feelings or annoyance or things of that nature, which you and I wouldn't normally think of as harm. I mean, they don't normally mean that you're making someone bleed or breaking their arm. It means they're just annoyed at what you said. And that kind of thing happens all the time, but it doesn't mean it should constrain your speech.
Do you think liberalism is blind to questions of inequality? If everyone does their own thing, some may get more power and some may have little power. Some may have great deals of wealth, others little bits of wealth. Partly perhaps because of what they do, partly because of the way the system is rigged.
Well, okay, but now I think you're broadening the subject a little bit because you're saying let's go beyond just the basic ethos of liberalism and how it actually works in real life. And that's a whole other area, isn't it? A philosophical investigation. Now you're looking at people who are looking at how do you set up a fair society so that those things don't happen.
I guess I'm asking the question, if you're saying liberalism has won the battle of ideas, but you notice it doesn't seem to have won the battle on the ground.
No.
And I'm wondering perhaps one of the reasons is it's not sufficiently coherent as a doctrine.
Possibly, because it's not really an ideology, is it? It's more of a way of thinking rather than a very specific kind of ideology, and therefore is open to different interpretations.
That's come through in the series, actually.
Different implementations. Yes, and I can see why, because I don't think it's an ideology. I think it is really more of a cast of thought. But there are people who have given a lot of thought to the question that you've asked. I mean, the most famous ones, the philosophers of politics, John Rawls, Robert Nozick, lots of them, looking at exactly that issue. I mean, it's one thing to say that you're in favor of equality under the law, but how do you do it? Especially in a world where people are not really equal, are they?
They're not equal in some things, but equal in other things. Yes, exactly.
Right. And so people have talked about that. And it's not the easiest thing in the world. And lots of people have always looked down. Liberalism has been criticizing itself since it was invented. I saw a book called Self-Criticism of Liberalism, actually, written in German. And I got the date here, I think it's 1843 it was. So
just before the revolutions of 1848 failed, yes.
So already self-criticizing, and always for that reason. How do you go from what sounds like a fair and reasonable proposition that most people will accept to implementation in a real society? And there are huge differences in what they come up with.
Yes, I think in one sense we are all liberals now. I speak of the West, not of other countries.
Up here.
Yeah.
What about on the ground?
Exactly.
In our brains, perhaps.
In our brains.
And our hearts.
You mentioned that liberalism is, I wasn't going to use the word vibe, that would be the vibe of the thing, but it's an attitude of mind, as well as a philosophy, I understand that. But it's not an ideology in your sense, right?
No.
And therefore it's competing often against much more well-defined and shaped ideologies.
Correct.
It's hard to be enthusiastic about a frame of mind, except when you're rebelling against oppressive regimes. That's when you see liberalism encouraging enthusiasms. Like I'm thinking of Europe at the fall of communism. There was great joy, the overthrow.
Of course.
And when liberalism came to its fruition in the 17th and 18th century, there was an overthrowing of oppressive regimes. Today, there's not a great deal of enthusiasm for it, at least in the West, because maybe we're not facing explicit threats.
When you say enthusiasm, I grew up in the USA. So I went to school in the USA and I grew up in the USA. And it would seem to me that it was imbued in all of us, even if it wasn't deliberate. So the stories that we were told, Jefferson, the founding fathers, Jefferson and Hamilton and John Payne and all, these were all the classical liberals living at the right time when what they were saying was radical, what they were saying was new, they were saying was different. When Washington said, no, I don't want to be the king, I'm not going to be crowned, I'll be called something else, that was a huge change from what would have happened even 50 years before, when nobody would think that way. So I think it was just part of the way we lived, that every school child in America was born into a kind of liberal way of thinking. And the Declaration of Independence made it quite explicit,
There is a sense,
natural rights.
There is a sense, isn't there? Is this right? That the founding of the United States of America was the first explicit attempt to found a liberal society, a liberal state, which many would have thought couldn't survive because monarchy was taken for granted.
I believe that's correct. I believe that when you think about, especially the first 100 years of the country, it was all about accepting that that's a possible way of living.
Right.
And if you could accept that that was a possible way of living, then you were welcome and you could come there.
Now,
and you could.
Can I raise the one big blind spot about the United States?
Sure.
All men created equal, except chattel slavery. Can you explain that to me?
Yes. Well, then now we come back.
Because this is due to a blind spot in a historical liberalism.
No, it's a horror and it's a disgrace. And, it's hard to put yourself in the brain of someone else, but it's surely a disgrace that happened and never should.
How did it happen, my question?
Well, I'm thinking that what you're looking at there is much more a problem with utilitarianism than with liberalism. Because what the utilitarian view, the Jeremy Bentham type view, is that, well, it may in fact maximize the utilities in the society.
It is the greatest happiness, the greatest number.
Yes, right. But you can get that in very odd ways. And sometimes by having a downtrodden class, a mistreated class, you can actually maximize everybody else's utilities and everybody else's happiness. It's a peculiar kind of
Is it not,
theory in a way.
To live and let live, but being blind to a whole group of human beings, you're not living to let live at all. In fact, you're depending on them.
Absolutely.
That surely must also to do with a view of the different values of human beings.
It would.
I'm talking
on the face of it, it must do.
Yes.
That you could actually blind yourself to the fact that these are other humans that you're mistreating. Clearly,
that you're not including in the circle of those who are to live and let live. They're not in the. I don't want to get pinned along with this, but it stands out.
It's a horror, and it's great that it's no longer something that you'll find very often or hardly at all. But you still have that same dynamic in places like the U.S., don't you, where the wealth of the country is in a large part dependent on some downtrodden people whose futures are very grim, whose pay is very low, poverty is extremely high. That actually is part of, I reckon, a utilitarianism that runs through many countries.
So, how is liberalism different from utilitarianism then? It has a moral basis?
Yes. Well,
an ethical basis?
I wouldn't say that that's how I would think the main difference would be. I think the main difference would be in how you would create the basis of society. I see it as very much, do you judge things by the consequences of their actions, or are there actual deontological rules that are above that?
Yes.
And I believe if you don't have the second, you will never have a just society. You can't have a just society based on utilitarianism, because unjust things will often give you very high levels of utility.
Yes, you can get, in the short term anyway.
Yes. That's right. Well, maybe even on the long term.
Yes, this raises an interesting question. One of the defining features of liberalism, as I understand it, is that a liberal society doesn't decide the big questions. It doesn't decide if God exists. No. It doesn't determine what is the chief end of man. It even, in many levels, allows people to have different moralities within a framework. And for some, this is very unsatisfying. We want it's a kind of unsettling to see a society in which these things are not determined by the centre. But you're saying to me, it still has to have some level of what you call deontological, things that are right, things that are wrong.
Correct.
For it to work.
Well, it won't work otherwise.
And what are those?
So one of those is non-aggression, which we've already mentioned. So in a just society, you are not forcing people to believe things that they don't want to believe, to go to churches they don't wish to go to in every way possible, to allow the individual to have the freedom and the breadth of functioning that they need in order to pursue a good life as they see it. So non-aggression is probably the basic.
Not non-compulsion aggression, you mean?
Yeah, in any way.
Okay.
So, but that's right, non-compulsion aggression. But also, there are sort of natural rights, right? They go right back to the beginning of liberalism and to the 17th century and 18th century commentaries, maybe culminating in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And those natural rights, they're not given by a state. They are yours because you're a human being. They are yours because you were born into this earth. And those, mean, also control about your own life, right? And your own.
So there's a set of clear, can't use the word values because values are not given, they're what we value, but clear truths, moral truths.
That's what I believe. And that's what
that liberalism must have to
and that was Robert Nozick's argument in his famous book. It's about natural, he calls them natural rights, the American constitutional Declaration of Independence, inalienable rights, but they are there because you are human. And they are mainly negative rights. They're all about what can't be done to you rather than what you can do, because you're not being given them by some rich state. They are yours, right? And you are free from compulsion, free from threats.
And the state is to recognize them and keep its place
and protect them.
And protect them.
That's the only role of the state, right? The state is there to protect you, so you can go and doing what you wish to do.
Yes, the trouble is when the state has a different set of moral rights than others. I mean, one of the troubles that I'm interested in is the issue of religious freedom in a liberal society, which is a very complex question, by the way, because what I do in my church or synagogue or mosque is one thing. The moment I try and run my Christian school or my Christian institution, I want to exercise certain freedoms to choose and maintain the integrity of the institution. The liberal state says that's discriminating against people's rights.
I think this is a bit more complicated than that.
Oh, yes, I agree with that. Yeah. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Because you could say that the role of the state in that particular example, which is schools, is to maintain your choice.
You could say that.
Yeah. So my role as a state, if I were a human, if I were the person embodying the state, my job is to make sure that you have a choice as to where you go to school. That's really all I need to do.
But what about the choice to me to have a school that has a certain character?
Yeah. That's the whole point. Otherwise, why would you choose one over the other? It's got to be because there's a reason why you want to go to one school rather than another.
So what would look like discrimination in one situation is merely selection for the sake of the identity of the school in another.
Why would it look like discrimination? Sorry.
Because I'm not going to hire you because you're not a Buddhist for my Buddhist school.
Right.
Normally, not hiring people for their religion is just not right.
No.
We don't allow sectarian selections.
Yeah, but what if
in this
they don't
context?
believe in I get it. What's the point of having a school that's Buddhist if you don't believe in Buddhism, but I have to hire you anyway?
My point is there's a danger here of an overly activist liberal state flattening out the very distinctions in theory they're meant to preserve, making us all alike in theory.
We talked about it a moment ago that liberalism is more of a state of mind than a specific ideology. So is there a necessary connection between flattening out and liberalism?
No, there isn't.
I don't think so either.
It's contingent totally. You've mentioned a number of times the founders or first thinkers of liberalism in the 18th century. You've mentioned the founding fathers of the United States. Does this mean that liberalism is an historical phenomenon, a contingent phenomenon, not a natural state of human beings? But not all naturally liberals. It's a particular form of thinking about the world, which has come into being in the West, in the Christian cultural Christian West, in the 18th and 19th century.
I think you're probably right. I don't think that I'm not really capable of telling you what's natural. I mean, only God knows what's natural. But I think it's widely held now. So widely held that people don't even see it as an ideology. Well, it isn't an ideology, but they don't even see it as something that needs to be discussed. I think it's the implementation of these things.
Yes.
I mean, if you go to really, where would you'd have to find someone who didn't believe that people should be treated equally, or didn't believe that everyone should have a chance in life,
Yes, they seem so obvious. They seem so obvious, don't they?
Well, that's right. They seem to be accepted wisdom.
In human history, they once were not obvious.
No, and there's places where they're not obvious now. But it would be hard to find people who would argue with you about things like that. But
what you do with it is the question you're saying.
Well, I think it's also when it gets down to very specific questions about shall I hire a non-Buddhist to work in my Buddhist school, or how shall I do how can I do affirmative action to allow someone who has not had life's advantages to get into a good university? When you get to very specific things like that, that's where the arguments occur, because they are very,
Well, let's go to that.
They're not black and white; they're grey, right?
Not only have you, you're a glutton for punishment. You've been a vice-chancellor not once, not twice, but 3 times.
I loved it. Yeah.
Tell me about the university in particular, where these principles apply. How easy was it to maintain a liberal society?
One that I know a lot about is, in fact, the whole area of admissions and treating people differently in this system. Because in 2004, I worked for the British government, and I did a review of all English universities, and we came up with a lot of anxieties about it. In fact, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain actually sponsored an early day motion in Parliament condemning me for some of the things that I was doing in university. So got to know Mr. Johnson.
On what grounds did Boris Johnson condemn you, Steven Schwartz?
Maybe condemning me is not the right word, but he wasn't happy. We were looking at admissions to particularly the ancient universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and whether they could be made fairer to people who were from low participation backgrounds who wouldn't in the past. And he didn't agree with what I was doing. And I'm a fellow at Balliol College. He was a student at Balliol College. Anyway, it was a good outcome because I called him up and said I wasn't happy with what he had said, and he took me out to lunch, and it was a really nice experience to meet him, and found that we agreed on more than we didn't agree on. But that area is important in the discussion that we've been having, because All of these things come to a head when you are looking at admissions and you're saying, I'm going to treat that person differently from that person because that person, the first one, belongs to a specific group. And all of the issues
That's complex, isn't it?
all the issues that revolve around liberalism then come out. Is there any argument for helping people because their backgrounds were poor? If there is, how much help can you give them? And so most people would say, well, it would be okay to advertise more widely. So maybe there are people who have gone to schools where no one's ever gone to Oxford and Cambridge. So you say, well, here's how you get in. And this is what you need to do. That nobody would object to that. So that would be like a little help.
Yes.
Or you might say they've never been there. They don't know anyone who's been there. They think it's just for rich people or toffs or someone. So you run a summer school and you allow people to spend a couple of weeks or a week at the university. They're not going to get in because of that. They still need to meet the same requirements as everybody else. But at least they demystify it a bit. They got experience. Well, this might not be a bad place. Look, quite neat, really. Or you could go even further and you can say, well, I'm not only going to advertise and I'm not only going to let them in, but I'm also going to provide maybe some tutoring so that they can be brought up to the right level. And it can go on and on until you get to the extreme, I would say the nuclear end of this, which is you have a quota and you say, we will take a certain number of people in that group and the class will be made of 10% women or minorities or whatever the quota is. And then you're reaching a point where you are the really clear, extremely illiberal approach to the problem because you're actually treating people as members of a group rather than as individuals. And you're saying that group is more important than that.
You change the rules
You change rules.
where it matters.
It matters.
That is, in admissions. It doesn't matter who gets to have a summer school,
No,
who gets to have extra tutoring.
no.
But if it comes to qualification to enter, you think that's crossing a line when that no longer becomes.
But even there, Rob, it gets grey. Everything is grey.
That's what I'm talking to you.
I went to visit one of the colleges at Cambridge University and Jesus College, which is one of the ones that was helping coordinate admissions for the whole university. And they were showing me what they were doing, and they were really doing a lot of advertising in deprived backgrounds. They were doing all the things that we were talking about up to point. But one of their admissions criteria that helped people get in is whether they were ducks of a school. And I said, well, do you know only private schools have duckses? And, so having that is a really discriminatory.
That's discriminatory the other way.
I hadn't thought of it. No, they didn't do it on purpose. They just hadn't thought of it. So it's all this black and white shades into gray when you try to implement things in the real world. And then at some point, you're going to have to make a line, right? Yes. And I would say that almost everyone I spoke to when we were doing that job, from the prime minister down, doesn't want a quota. It just is unfair. It is unfair on the surface, and it's unfair in practice to do that. But there are a lot of other things you could do, which some people wouldn't approve of, but which still.
In other words, the theme of what you're saying is that liberalism as a frame of mind, you can get relative confident unanimity on that. But the moment you've got to actually make judgments about how to apply it in particular situations, people have different outcomes.
Right, unless they want to be very doctrinaire.
And that's not the nature of liberalism.
Well, no, it becomes libertarianism then, because you're going to the extreme, right? You're going.
How do you see the distinction between liberalism and libertarianism?
Ayn Rand said that. How did you say? Libertarians are the hippies of the left. Right? I think she got it right. Yeah, I think she's about right.
That is, for them, liberty of the individual is an overriding a principle.
Correct.
And the devil take the hindmost.
Correct.
Yeah.
No matter what unfairness developed. I much prefer Robert Nozick, and even John Rawls, although they were from different ends of the same thing. That really, the way I see it, it starts with a set of natural rights, these deontological rules that we said. It starts there. And then from there, we have to obviously live together. And how we distribute the awards of a society, like admission to a good university or new jobs, all of that needs to be worked out pretty much as you go. Yes. There's not any real secret to any lock that you can then just open with a key and there's
There it
your
is.
answer. It's always going to be something that's a work in progress, isn't it? Because, it was, I'm pretty sure that the biggest issue is redistribution. So if there are people who are down in the bottom of a society, they're struggling, they don't have the resources of everyone else, is there a way to help them which is not illiberal, which doesn't sort of violate other people's? And that's the hardest issue in the whole of political philosophy to answer.
Yes.
Nozick believed Rawls was illiberal. Because he wanted them.
Some redistribution, yes.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Redistribution that always favored the people at the bottom.
Yes.
Whereas Nozick was saying, well, it's not always unfair that someone's up top. Sometimes it's entirely fair that they're up there. I always use the example of Elvis, Elvis gives a concert in a small town. He walks out with everybody's money, but they're happy. They enjoyed the concert. He has where's the unfairness here?
I don't think anyone thinks that's unfair.
I don't know, because Thomas Piketty says it's unfair that people are rich and there are other people who are poor.
In my view, it depends why.
Yes.
It depends why they're rich and whether that richness is gained by a system that is benefiting them against others, I guess.
Well, but politicians in this country and in other countries have said that inequality is the biggest issue facing the world. I think that was Barack Obama. And, we had similar things here, that just because people are different doesn't mean they're unfair. But sometimes it does.
Yes, because liberalism does believe in the dignity and equality of individuals before the law.
Yeah.
Yes, and in the society. Can I ask you a final question? And maybe you can't answer this because your very philosophy is liberalism on the whole is believed, but it's hard to live in practice. Are you optimistic about the future of liberalism?
I think we need a new look at liberalism. I do. I do think the world as exists now is kind of turned upside down from the world that I'm used to. The policies that are being put forward by formerly the conservative side of politics, both the Republican Party of the US, the Liberal Party here, the Conservative Party in the UK, are often the policies that used to be associated with the other side, with Democrats and Labour, and vice versa. We're getting a much more complicated set of politics now. We still talk about left and right in Australia all the time. You hear it on podcasts, you hear it on the news, especially if you listen to some of the cable networks. It's all lefty, righty. There is no left and right anymore that makes any sense. I mean, people who are on the right now believe things that used to be purely lefty, and vice versa. I think there's now just an up and down. There are people who think we should have autonomous individuals and we should try to organize our society to the extent that's possible to give people the flexibility to live their lives and flourish as they wish. Or there are people who want to control you. And they want to control every aspect of it, what you're allowed to say and where you're allowed to go and what you're allowed to do and the attitude you're allowed to have. It's more of an up and down than a left and right. And Reagan said that years ago, but I think now it's really true.
And you're an up, not a down.
I want to be an up, yes. But what we'll have to do...
Who will win?
I also believe in some of the traditional religious views. I believe in solidarity. I do think that it's more than just individuals. Mrs. Thatcher got into terrible trouble when she was Prime Minister by saying there's no such thing as society. But what she meant is not wrong, is it? There is no. I mean, there are individuals leading their lives. You're an individual. We're all leading our lives individually. There is no other thing out there. But we do still owe things to the other members.
To communities, to nations, to
the question is families. Who owes them? Do you owe them or does the government owe them? And I think that's the big issue that we need to work out. Because the rate we're going now, it's all about the government owes them. So the government will do things. Government will look after your education, after your health, after your moral wealth. Everything that's wrong with you or wrong in the world will be a government solution. The history shows that's not going to work. It isn't. It never has and never will. So how do we get back to the civil society that we always used to hope for? How do we get back to Edmund Burke's little platoons out there doing things? And how do we get back to friendly societies, which ran through Australia at one point, where people would contribute and then give the help to people when they need it? How do we get back to doing that? so that's one of the issues. The other thing I think needs to be looked at very carefully, and I don't know the answer to this. I know what the wrong answer to it is, and that is esteem. There are a huge number of people now who don't feel that they have any self-esteem, or they don't esteemed by society. And you see this in a lot of the Trump rallies and in America, but also here as well, where they feel they're neglected, they feel they're not valued, they feel they're not important, they feel left out. And you get that Hillary Clinton, these are, I can't remember the exact word.
Basket of deplorables.
There you go, basket of deplorables, that sort of thing. There are people in this category who are getting more and more alienated and turning more and more to populist solutions, strongman solutions, Trump, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and all the others. And how we deal with all of that will make a huge difference to what happens.
How the promise of liberalism of equal dignity and esteem, how that is applied to them.
But we don't at the moment, do we? We have it in our heads that should, but we don't, Rob, and it needs to do.
Steven Schwartz, thank you very, very much. Fascinating. This has been another podcast from the Centre for Independent Studies. For decades, the CIS has been an independent voice working to deliver evidence-based policy within a classical liberal framework. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our cause. Head to cis.org.au to see how you can get involved. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for listening.